Sim, sim. Primeiro, eu gostaria de solicitar aos participantes que colocassem no chat, os que forem alunos da UNB, o nome e o número de matrícula, e os que não forem alunos da UNB, o nome e o CPF. Paulo, it's a great joy to welcome my colleague, you, for this mini course in Methods in Cultural Psychology. I appreciate for all your time and your generosity, and I thank the participants present, and I also, again, ask you to send in the chat their name and registration. And I ask them also to keep the microphones closed during the mini course. Enjoy, and again, thank you, Paulo.
Thank you very much for having me today. In this afternoon, I'd like to talk about, I want to propose you a framework, a methodology framework that stems from cultural psychology. So I'd like to share with you some theory, some reference to the framework, and how we can use this framework to create a model useful for gathering data, analyzing data in research, especially in research done on the field, so outside the laboratory and with the real everyday interaction, human interaction. So I'll start by my screen sharing. I'd like to give also some time for question or discussion after the presentation. So maybe I'll just take not so much time with the presentation to give you more time for the discussion. So let me start by trying to address some issue concerning cultural psychology. Cultural psychology is a theory that in some way considered a young theory, because the history of cultural psychology was unknown to the Western society till half of the past century, till 70, 80 of the past century. Before cultural psychology, in psychology, and especially in social psychology, we have a clear definition of what's culture, what we intend with culture. But also taking some information from other disciplines near the social psychology, we can look at a sort of trajectory that the definition of culture has gone through in the last century. We start in Italy usually differentiating two concepts linked with the meaning of culture, and this concept is well explained by two German words, Kultur and Zivilisation. That means one means the shared values, the language, the symbols that people use in their everyday interaction. This is the meaning of culture. And for civilization, the other means is the number of material goods, the homogeneity and the reproducibility of this behavior in different time and settings. For authors like Malinowski, Boas, and Mead, culture is intended as a set of meaning building practice of activities that the society used to create meaning around some object, social object. And from this first tentative definition of culture, social psychology developed an own vision of culture that we defined reified vision. That means something that is make concrete, make objectified. And in this definition, culture is considered a differentiator and a marker of group identity. The best example for this definition is the definition used inside the cross-cultural model of research, where we confront group of people on the basis of their cultural identities. Known are the studies that confront, I don't know, Italian people and German people on some characteristics, differentiating both group on the same aspect. So in this way, culture is considered a property of social group, a thing that belongs to them and connotes them, separate them from others, from other group, and it's intended to consider this group like homogeneous inside. So we tend to consider in this dimension all the Italian people similar and with the same characteristics as opposite as to the ones from the other country. But this kind of research, cross-cultural research, was and it is also now very present in literature. The first study was done at the end of the 19th centuries, and was the studies done by the first explorer that went to places like New Zealand and the Torres Sea, and they study the difference between this culture, this group of people, and the people from Europe on the basis of their ability to sense and to see and to hear, to see shape and to hear noise. So this type of research contributes to the imaging of trajectory, the evolutionary trajectory in culture, where the people from Torres and Oceania tend to be more similar, more nearer to nature. So they need to develop this kind of sense. Whereas in Italy and in Europe, people live in city, and so they didn't need this kind of ability, and they have less acuity of the sense. But this, and as you can see, this approach tends to differentiate culture and in fact gives to these groups different value. And this kind of research, this model was bring to attention during the 50s of the last century, when especially in the USA, there was a big development of testing, especially IQ testing and assessment of intellectual abilities. They use these tests to assess the ability of the population, but in reality they are using cultural separation. So they confront this result from Afro-Americans, confronting them with white Americans, with Hispanic, trying to see if there's something that differentiates these abilities, not on the basis of individual capabilities, but on the basis of the belonging to different cultures. And from the 70s to today, these kind of research are very present, and they are intended and focused on the quantification of differences between different cultural groups. But if you see, when we try to go to the field and we go out of our laboratory, and so we don't use no more questionnaires, but we observe people, we interact with people, it's very difficult to find this clear differentiation between culture. In this extract is taken from a book of Gerd Baumann. He's an anthropologist, and he studies in this book the culture and the people that live in Southall. Southall is a neighbor of London, and in this extract I'd like to read it to you. Even assuming that community was a matter of birthplace, so the idea that your belonging to a community was a matter of where you were born, as the dominant discourse so often does, some Southallians, the inhabitants of this neighbor, could, among friends, squeeze a laugh out of the absurdities of ethnic classification. They said, see, my friend Jess here, said Phil, an Englishman, and pointed to his drinking mate at the Railway Tavern bar. He is an Asian, but he's born in Africa, so I'd say he's an African. And me, I was born in Burma, so I'm the Asian here, aren't I? And Winston here, you think he's a West Indian? He's the only one of us born in this town, so he is the Englishman born and bred. So attribution of culture and community can clearly not be reduced to one factor alone, the place where you were born or the place where your parents were born. Rather, all but most single-minded of adult Southolians, it turned out regard themselves as members of several communities at once, each with its own culture. And I think that these words from Bauman is very interesting. This word is from page 5. So the start of his book, in which he described his ethnography of this neighbor. So it's clear that at the beginning, Bauman was aware of this problem. He went there to study the multicultural setting in this neighbor, but what he found was not a multicultural context, but an intercultural context. So something that doesn't distinguish between community, but something that is focused on what happens when community live together. So the model that stems from this vision of culture, the reified vision, so that we belong to just one culture, is at the basis of the multicultural model that in most of the Anglo-Saxon world, English, United States, Australia, tend to adopt this model. The idea of this model is not entirely bad. This model wants to give to community the right to belong to a place, and this place will be the place where they can foresee their cultural heritage. They can continue to do their folkloristic practice without interfering with the other community, the other neighbor. But this multicultural model creates segregation. As you can see in this image is taken from this demographics project at Virginia University in the US, and they map out on the geography of a physical context. In this case, what you see is a bird eye view of the islands of Manhattan. And you can see that they represent every 25 people with one dot, one colored dot. And there's different color based on the ethnicity, the cultural belonging of these people. So as you can see, there's a real segregation of this community. And if on one end, this segregation could allow them to be as genuine towards their cultural meanings, it can stand the society, because as we always obviously know, there's family that interact across this border, across the segregation of this neighbor. So a child born from an Italian man and an Asian woman has no place to live in this kind of city. He loses all of his cultural identity, and we call these people the slash identities, because we tend to refer to them as Asian Italian, but what they are really is the dash that separates Asian from Italian. So in the everyday life, this multicultural model could bring to a lot of social problems. In recent years, in France, we had in Europe a big uprising. A big uprising in the neighbor of Paris, where the multicultural model was used to control and separate different migrants community in the same space, in the same urban space. From this preliminary definition of culture as a thing, as something that people belongs to, cultural psychology tries to propose another vision, the instrumental vision, stemming from the idea of Vygotsky, so that the development of the psyche is guided and influenced by the social context, hence by the culture of the particular place and the historical moment in which the individual is living. So with the tools that this environment gives to the people to interact, and the first tools for Vygotsky would be the language, a cultural artifact that allows us to interact with each other. But the interesting point is that not only culture could be viewed as a tool, something that guides us in our everyday interaction, but is also something that is built on a particular context in terms of geographic space and also historical moment. So with this vision, we can, for example, assess the difference in meaning that we use in everyday life. But there's difference between generation. I mean, maybe there's a difference, we can find difference in the meaning that we give to work environment, to the meaning of work. And there's difference because this meaning is constructed from the tools that culture gives us in that moment. So there's some difference in age group, but also in the different throughout space. This instrumental vision was used by one of the father of cultural psychology, that is Michael Cole. And it's interesting, the stories around Michael Cole, because he was a cross-cultural researcher in his first days.
Presidente, onde está o cortador de queijo? Me conta. Cortador de queijo?
Solicito a quem está com o seu microfone ligado que apague o microfone, por gentileza.
Okay. The history of Michael is quite interesting. He was a cross-cultural researcher. In fact, his book, Cultural Psychology, a Once and Future Discipline, was written from a reflection that he made after a big research done in Liberia, state of Central Africa. He went to Liberia in the 70s to study with a great funding from USA to study the mathematical ability of the inhabitants of Liberia, a small group named Kpelle. And he wants to know if their mathematical abilities are comparable to the one from the same age group in the USA, because they want to bring to Liberia some farm and some factory for the production. So they need experienced worker that they can teach and train with the same reference material that they use in the USA. So making a clear cross-cultural model of research, he brings to Liberia their tests that they use annually to assess the quality of mathematics learning for the K-12 students in USA. So he already has the results from one group, the group of USA citizens, and now he needs to collect the same data from the Liberian people. He went to Liberia, some minutes of this test, and gathered the results. And analyzing the results, this test shows without any doubt that Liberian people, the child from the Kpelle community, has no mathematical abilities. They can't do basic calculus. But for my call was more interesting the fact that he lives with these people. He passed some time with them, and one of the activities that carried out by the baby, especially by the little children, the female children, was to bring the goods that the family produce to the market and to sell them. So Cole follow them in this practice and see that they have, with no doubt, mathematical abilities. They can do fast calculus without needing of paper and pencil. They are very able to contract the cost of the goods and to make change of one good from another, taking into account the value, the monetary value of their goods. So my call asked themselves why. With my test, I produce results. The results will be that there's difference from USA children and Liberian children in the way that the USA children are viewed as more able. But using another method, the observation, you can see that clearly that these same ability are more used more frequently and with more success by the Liberian children. So reflecting upon this, he thought about the Vygotsky reference to the importance of the tools that culture gives to the people to develop their psychic ability. So he thought of his questionnaire as a tools that we use to make emerge some quality. And at the same time, the work in the market for the child in Liberia was the same. It was a tool that they used to assess their mathematical ability. So the problem is not on the difference in the culture. For my call, the problem is in using the same tools to obtain the same comparable results. So for Cole, the tools that we use to gather data are the artifacts that mediate our understanding of the world. So changing the artifacts, it will change the knowledge that it could produce. As in this case, one instrument say clearly that there's difference, the other one said that there's no difference. So from this reflection, my call propose a way to understand the process of mediation that happens between individuals in their interaction. And referring to culture as an instrument, something that we use to interact, I'd like to use this citation from McCutcheon. McCutcheon was a professor, now he's an emeritus professor in psychology. He teaches in Florence, in the University of Florence. And he writes, the mind operates within a specific historical and cultural context, characterized by a world of objects and people, relationship between people and social institutions that is constantly changing. While acting in this context, the mind does not remain unaffected. It is not a kind of machine, a kind of submarine that sails in the depths of any sea with the condition of always remaining impermeable to the waters that buffet of this or that ocean. Just as it navigates, its functioning changes in relation to the specific medium in which it is interacting. In other words, the mind is always situated in a context, historical, cultural, social. When born, the child is immediately placed in an already constructed world of networks of objects, relationship, and social institutions. This new mind becomes a component of the network itself, and this insertion modifies the structures and functioning of the network. So the idea is that when we're born into a culture that gives us some instruments, and our use of this instrument, our participation in the interaction inside the culture, make the culture something new. So it expands the network of meaning. Cultural psychology, so one of the main concepts that brings to the attention of the researcher is the concept of mediation and of the artifact of mediation. You know, we in psychology start observing and studying the behavior of human beings by observing the relationship between them and the external world. So we tend to consider this interaction like a linear interaction between a subject and an object. But for my call and for the cultural psychology framework, we see that there's something that mediates this interaction, mediates it by giving us, like with culture, you know, there's some way of telling things, some narration, some history that we use to know what's good or bad to do in some situation. In Italy, we have some phrases that we use to say that the ancient people give us this suggestion, this instruction to interact in the world. Like it's better an egg today than a cow tomorrow, than a chicken tomorrow. Is something that we have in our culture, is narration that says and help us in knowing and interacting with the world. So this interaction is not a direct interaction between a subject and the object, but it's something that's mediated. And obviously, if we use one instrument, one artifact for mediating our knowledge of this object, we know of this object only what the artifact can show us. We can't access the natural object. We always access one of the many possible mediated objects. Like in the study of Cole, if he use the questionnaire, the testing, he obtained one mediated object. That's the knowledge of one mediated object. That's the less competence from the Liberian people. If he use the observation, he access another mediated object. It's the same object, but mediated by another artifact, like observation, make emerge other meaning. At the same time, for cultural psychology, there's no way that we can act directly on an object. Every of our action or behavior is mediated by something, by culture, by the tools that we use physically to interact. In this moment, we are interacting throughout technology, throughout internet. So our way of interacting is mediated by this instrument. And so the kind of interaction that we can make in this context is dependent on the instrument that we are using. But another interesting is that so we can we can access infinite mediated objects, because changing our instrument, our artifact of mediation, we access different aspects of the same object. And moreover, finally, we can consider subject and the mediation artifact not as two separate entities, because the subject is the people, the individuals who possess these artifacts of mediation culture. So it's inevitable for him to use it in his everyday interaction. I mean, every one of us has a meaning of the term mother, but every one of us has different experience and different meaning associated with this term that depends on our culture, our experience, and how we and which kind of artifact we use to define this object. The last vision proposed by cultural psychology about culture is called narrative vision. And it's a vision that sees culture as an history that we tell others and we tell to ourselves to describe what we are. So for Sila Ben-Habib, in her book of 2002, she said, any view of culture has clearly deniable walls. It's a view from the outside that generates coherence for the purpose of understanding and control. Participants in the culture, by contrast, experience their traditions, stories, rituals and symbols, tools, and material living conditions throughout shared, albeit contested and contestable narrative accounts. From within, a culture does not appear as a whole. Rather, it forms an horizon that recedes each time one approaches it. So what they're saying, she's saying that first of all, we can't consider culture as something clearly visible. This cultural group, as Bauman in the previous extract told us very clearly, try to escape this categorization. One example is to think about. It's quite difficult in Brazil. I use an example in Italy when I talk about this concept. We in Italy have a large group of Sinti and Rom people. They are nomads who live mostly in tent and in caravan camper near big urban cities, and we have a way of see these people that so dependent on the stereotype that we consider this kind of community as a whole. They are for us they are very homogeneous. So I use this example with my students. Try to close your eyes and think of a nomad woman, and then ask what they thought, what they see, and everyone described the same woman, a woman with long black hair, with a long shirt, that are surrounded by little children that are going throughout the street asking for money. But when I pose the same question, but with some little difference, so I ask them, now close your eyes and think about an Italian woman. Every one of them produced a different vision, a different description of this woman. So it's clearly that from the outside, when or perhaps you have to judge an Italian man like me, most of the time you tend to use something that creates a reified vision of culture. You have meaning about what for you means to be Italian, and mostly you think that I in some way belong to this narration. But if you think at Brazilian, you know that Brazilians are very heterogeneous, they are very different. So it's more difficult for you to consider your culture with the reified vision. And this also explain very well the real purpose behind the multicultural model. Multicultural model is used to control and understand this different culture in the same place. The narrative vision is quite interesting because it's at the basis of what we call the intercultural approach. So an approach where we are not focused on the differentiation between communities, cultural communities, but we are interested in interaction between these communities that usually are not so different. And within this interaction, in an intercultural model, we can obtain something that's very valuable for our culture. So the idea that the culture can evolve throughout this interaction with other cultures. And this story is quite interesting in reference to the work of Rosaldo. Rosaldo was an ethnographer, an anthropologist, and during the 60s, he went to study a population of Borneo that the Inlingot, they call it Inlingot, and they were famous because they are headhunter. And during his project of research, during his PhD research, Rosaldo went to this community to study this practice. He wanted to study how and why, with which meaning they go to headhunting their enemies. And he described it in this encounter in a way that we can see clearly how in this interaction between culture, there's always some form of judgment that we use to assess the meaning of the other culture. So when he asked to the Illingot about their practice of headhunting, the reply that he received was, how could you think such a thing of us? I had carry you across the stream. I fed you. I cared for you. How could you think such a thing? And he was quite astonished by this, because he thinks that he can study, he can conclude his PhD research in this community, and he found that their practice, the practice that he's interested in, they are no more doing it. But after about a year of tour, so when he began to be accepted by the community, his Hillingot brother, Tukbav, when they are flying with a small plane over a field, he pointed below and said, that's where we raided. And he went to tell him that he had gone headhunting there more recently than Rosaldo dared imagine. And soon everyone began to tell Rosaldo the same story. How do they go to headhunting? And he immediately understand that almost all of the people have taken some head in the last month, and so he is quite. For him, it's quite a news that someone that he asked he thinks without any judge, he received a negation. But yeah. I'm online, and I don't know if there's. Ok. Ma sono l'unico? I'm the only one online now? No.
For us, I guess.
Okay.
Okay. So when check il microfono.
Era só para atrapalhar mesmo. Era só para atrapalhar.
Ok.
Ok.
Pensi tu a chiudere i microfoni?
It's closed.
Noemi, I think your microphone is on.
Yes. Okay. And as I said, yeah, he was quite surprised that something that they've negated just some time before, now they are so open to talk about. And he sees in this his role in this process. Maybe when he asked them about this practice, inevitably he gave them a judgment, because it appears clear to them that they are judged upon this practice. The other history interesting with this interaction came sometime later. In fact, he wrote, some months later, I was classified 1A for the draft. It was the period of the war, the Vietnam War. So I was able to go to fight in Vietnam. And but the reaction from the Illingot people was surprising for Rosaldo, because these are a community of warriors that go to hunting their enemy quite often, and he thought that they will judge him negatively if he doesn't want to go to Vietnam to fight. And instead, the companions immediately told him not to fight in Vietnam, and they offered him to take him in their homes. And he wrote, thought it corresponded to my sentiments. Their offer could not have surprised me more. Unthinkingly, I had supposed that headhunters would see my reluctance to serve in the armed force as a form of cowardice, Instead, they told me that soldiers are men who sell their bodies. Pointedly, they interrogated me, how can a man do what a soldier do and command his brothers to move into the line of fire? This act of ordering one one's men, one's brothers, to risk their lives was utterly beyond their moral comprehension. So there's something that also for the illingot was incomprehensible in our society, the way in which we do modern war. Because modern warfare for them was seen as an act of prostitution, an act of selling our bodies to be a soldier and to be in complete command of another man, a brother. And the interesting thing is that in this interaction, we can see clearly the intercultural emerge, because on one way, throughout this interaction, both parties, Rosaldo and the illingot, could see throughout the eyes of the other how their moral world are defective. So with this encounter, Rosaldo not only judged in different way his illingot friends, because now he saw that they do this practice, but also in some way they need to cover this practice because they think that other people could judge them negatively. But on the other way, this encounter permits also Rosaldo to see how his own culture is deficient and in some way on the moral level. So throughout the intercultural dimension, we can see how this interaction brings more new meaning to our culture and to other in this model. So the intercultural model has three main keywords to consider. Sorry, I didn't translate this, but it means power, agency, and positioning. So the idea is that we have to be able to position ourselves as we want. And this quote from Bamberg is quite interesting. He said, "This is the way I want you to understand me here and now." This concept is linked to the theory of positioning, the idea that we can not refer only to our identity when we interact with others. So I'm an illingot, so I'm an headhunter, and I'm a warrior, a brave warrior. You are Rosaldo, you are from USA, and you are someone that wants to study and to judge our practice. Positioning allows us to change this way in which we use identity to interact with others. So I may be positioning myself here as a psychologist, but I can position myself here as an Italian man or a tourist. On the other level, we have agency, so the ability to interact, to act upon the context, to change the context, and we can change the context starting from our positioning. Only if you are aware of our positioning and we are able to express this positioning, we have an useful agency to get to the power of the situation. So the idea in intercultural model is to try to give people the occasion to position themselves in a way that the researcher or the administration in some case has not even thought about. From this concept, we can start to think now that we come to a definition of culture that is very distant from the initial definition that we have in the cross-cultural model. So culture is no more a mediation, an object that people belongs to. It's not only an instrument for the mediation, for interaction, but is also something that pervades our interaction throughout a narrative. The idea of Ben Habib was that this narrative was in some way shared among us. So we can think about a dimension that comprehends our community member, but is also so its share is contested. So not everyone share the same vision of this meaning. I think about feminist new movement in Italy that propose a new meaning of what's the meaning to be a woman in our society. So they share the old vision, and in some way they try to contrast this meaning, this narration. And throughout this process, the narrative of the culture could change and could modify. So we say that it's a narration shared, contested, and renegotiated. And starting from this, so from this definition of culture, we can see that cultural psychology gives us different way of studying, and we are now entering in the methodology discourse, a way of study this kind of interaction. In the past, as we see before, for psychology, it's interesting to see how a subject knows or transforms an object, an internal and external object. After this first phase in psychology, we tend to consider a two-way kind of interaction where the subject, now we call it agent, acts upon an object, usually the environment, and at the same time, the environment acts upon and changes the instance of the agent. This space is just a little more explicative than the other model because it comprehends this effect of the environment on the agent, but it's not enough to see the structure of interaction inside this context. So cultural psychology proposed a new model that's called situated action theory that see on one end the actor. Now we call it actor because it can change position inside this interaction, and the environment on the other side. And actor is a bringer of interest. He has interest in the situation. At the same time, environment offers him opportunities. And the goals are generated throughout the interconnection of interest and opportunities. For the situated action theory, it's important to consider that every kind of action is in some way situated. There's no action that happens outside the context with no reference to the context. So not only the context is important, and we have to take into account the context when we do our research, but what constitutes the context, how you categorize the words, arise together with processes that are coordinating physical activity. So we see the context inside the interaction that we observe. To be perceiving the world is to be acting in it. So if you observe, if you just be present in a context, at the same time you are acting on this context, changing its structure. From a technical point of view, the situated action theory starts from this diagram that shows us the environment represented by the line and the cross and the arrow that starts from the letter E, and the agent inside. And the yellow dot is where it's a matching between the interest of the agent and the opportunities of the environment. When there's no matching, there's just two solutions. The actors can change slightly his interest, or if he has agency, he can change the opportunities, transform the opportunities of the environment to arrive to an action that's feasible in this context. One way of analyzing this situation is to consider other two elements that are present, that are the principles, the rules, the norms that in some way govern the situation, and the artifacts, the tools, the meaning that we use in our everyday life. And principle and artifacts are linked by a very strict relation, because principle give meaning to artifacts, and at the same time, the use of artifacts, using the artifact, we make principles operative. So there's this link that we can see in practice. For example, in this picture, you see from some time ago an everyday situation, quite common also at our time, where we can see there's a lot of artifacts. In this context, we maybe could infer some information just by looking at the photo. We know that there's some kind of power expressed by the position around the table of this family. We see that there's some concrete artifacts like the fork and the dish that people are using in this context, and we can consider these as artifacts. So there's some principle that in some way give meaning to these artifacts, and in this context, the principle that we can simply observe are that you don't bring food to your mouth with your hands, and food is eaten in individual dishes. So for us that live in a context similar to the one represented by this picture, it's quite easy to understand what the principle linked with this artifact. But when we change the situation, for example, in this situation is again a dinner, but outside our reference, our meaning, we can't understand why the people are in this place. Someone is seated, someone is just on his heels, and not everyone has a dish, but there's two big bowls that just two persons are using, and we have no information to understand the meaning of these artifacts, why they are using these artifacts in this way, and why they are positioned in reference one to another in this way. Knowing some information, so participating in this kind of activity make the meaning more visible for the researcher, and so we can try to explain the meaning at the basis of these artifacts. Just a moment, and this is quite important because when we observe an interaction, a natural context, artifacts are always present, but not always visible. And also, it's very difficult to study, analyze an artifact in absence of his use. I mean, quite often when I go to ancient markets in Italy, we have quite every 2 weeks a big market in Padua where they sell antiquariato and objects from the rural past of Italy. And in a lot of cases, also the man who's selling them doesn't know what their use, what their meaning for. And so we lost a lot of information because we are no more able to see how these artifacts were used. And the same happens when we are in front of technological artifacts. In many cases, artifacts are developed by people, developer, technician, that are not the same people that are going to use this instrument. So when we use this instrument, we try to create a map of meaning that we associate with this tool and try to infer this relationship with the principles that are at the basis of the technology. This is the problem why in most of the organization, when we try to introduce some change in the practice and especially in the use of instrument for doing this practice, we observe high resistance by the people, the workers, because they, in many cases, don't know the link with the principle that these new artifacts are able to activate. So when we observe the situation, the one defined by the situated action theory, so the objects, the actor and the environment that interact together, we are talking about one level of the social context. With Mantovani, we proposed a model, the three-level model of the social context, that starts from situated action theory that we see represented in level two, interpretation of the situation. So the level where the social actors interact together to arrive to a shared interpretation of the situation. So we are here in some way sharing the interpretation of what we are doing here now. And in this level, the interaction is between, as we see before, interest and opportunities. So interest of the actor and opportunities bring by the event, the environment. And so we can achieve our goal observing this kind of circular interaction. But there's also other level. There's a more material level, more concrete level, the level 3, that we call interaction with the environment, where we can see the artifact. And in this case, the interaction is between the user, so the user of the artifact, and the artifact itself, the tools. And this is a form of interaction, as we said before, a way in which not only one act upon another, but they co-construct themselves. So the user change itself using some tools, but also the tools is changed by the user using it. And in this level, we can see how we complete tasks, simple tasks or complex tasks, by throughout this interaction with the tool. And then there's a more abstract level of the context that we call construction of context, social context, where the interaction are between the structure, so the structure of power inside this context, and the practice, so the group of goals that together make sense to the entire situation. And throughout the interaction between practices and the structure of power, we construct the history of the context. So with this three-level model, we can see the process of construction of history, goals, and tasks, but we can also see the inverse process. So we can deconstruct the task, the goals, and the history, observing past interaction between practices and structure, between interests and opportunities, and between user and tools. And this kind of model is quite useful to implement qualitative methodology in everyday observation, because every level is responsible for one aspect of the same situation. In this example that you see on the right, I try to give an example. In the level 2, interpretation of situation, what you could see if it's more bigger, but it's a piece of the Facebook chat, where we can, in fact, observe as a researcher what the content of the interaction between the user in this chat, and see how their interests and the opportunities that the chat offer them interact to reach a certain goals. But at the same time, we have to take into account that this chat is not a chat like other, but it's inside a social network, Facebook. So it has to adhere to the rules that Facebook has, but also to the tools, the concrete tools that Facebook gave to the user. And at the same time, in a more broad context, we are observing an interaction that happens because there's some kind of aim for the participant. In this case, what you see is one of the buildings of the Department of Psychology in Padua. So analyzing all the three levels, we can see that what's happening in this situation is something that has to do with the context, the physical context, so Facebook and chat, but at the same time with a more broad context that is the University of Padua. So observing this interaction, we can see that the people who are interacting are the students of a course. So their interaction are not only determined by the tools that they're using, Facebook, or the content of the interaction between them on the chat system, but also by the rule and the norms that govern the context of the University of Padua. So applying this three-level model in front of your object of research, you can identify some different objects to study with different tools and different methods. So now I'm going to show you just the last slide, and then I'll give you some time for comment and discussion. Because with this model, we can triangulate, so we can assess one of the principle of quality and validity of the qualitative research. As you know, in qualitative research, we have opposite criteria for validate our research than the quantitative research. So we talk about contingency, the idea that our observation depends on the specific context and situation. We talk about reflexivity, the idea that the researcher brings some interest in the research. So it's not a neutral observer, but always has some interest in the situation, and he has to explain and make it visible to the audience. And at the end, the triangulation principle, the idea that we can use we have to use different type of data and different type of methodology and methodology of analysis to analyze this data. So, for example, with this model, we can triangulate because in the data gathering, because we can use, for example, interview to address what happened at the level 2 of the interpretation of situation. So asking social actor what are their interests and what are the opportunities that they perceive inside the context. And we can also do other kind of research like archive research or the analysis of media, of the press, to see how the structure and the practice inside the context interact between each other to create the history of the context. And finally, we can use direct observation to see how the artifacts are used by the user inside the context of research. And we can, at the same time, we can see that at different levels, we can use different methods of analysis. For example, in the level 2 of the interpretation of situation, we usually adopt discourse analysis. So we are interested in the context of the interaction between actors, so what they say in terms of content. But it's also important the dimension that permit us to see how the social actor use the artifact that is language. So we use conversation analysis to see the talking interaction that happens during this situation. So it's not more focused on the words that the people use, but how they pronounce these words, with which tone of voice, with which volume of voice, with which gesture they use to accompany their talk. And lastly, we can use critical discourse analysis to assess the level of construction of context. So we are interested in seeing and observing the dynamics of power and the different roles that present in every context, and how these roles and the power that linked with them can change the meaning of the interaction in terms of content and also in terms of the use of the language, so the tools and the artifacts. So I think that we can stop here my presentation and give you some time.
Fa un po' di eco. Fa un po' di eco.
C'è qualcuno col microfono aperto. Okay, and so we can use this time for some question or more broad discussion on these terms. I hope that this context is new for you, or otherwise is a useful way to see how here in Padua we work on these topics. So thank you.
Grazie. Thank you, obrigada. Vamos então agora passar as perguntas, né? We are going to start now a dialogue. There are some requests here in the chat. People, Professor Wilson Ramos is asking if you can put in the chat some of your publications, if you have a book on the method, on how to triangulate.
Okay, on the triangulation, there's a very good text by Uwe Flick. I can share it with you if you want. And I also have all the book from which I take the extract in this presentation. I think I can share it on the chat right now.
And if you want, I have also the Spanish version translation of this guide of Uwe Flick. Perhaps for somebody it's much easier to read it in Spanish, so I will share it as well. Unfortunately, I don't have the Portuguese version. It exists actually, but it's not available for free on internet.
Yeah. I think Gunther published the translation, didn't he? I don't know. He had the translation to Portuguese, but I don't know if it's available. Well, if you can share all of them or afterwards.
Okay. I'm sharing right now some book from Ruth Wodak, Toyn van Dyke, and Norman Fakelow. They're authors all linked with the critical discourse analysis theory. And then I'll try to find the other.
Grazie. Então agora, I'm going to speak in Portuguese so that they can maybe just put a hand up and we get the questions. It's easier. Então, gente, agora quem quiser fazer as perguntas, eu acho que pode levantar a mãozinha aí nas reações, tá? Tem a mãozinha aqui, não tem a mãozinha para levantar, ou talvez no... Cadê? Onde que está levantando a mãozinha? Alex?
Não, eu não levantei, mas eu só para dizer, achei o livro do Uwe Flick em português mesmo.
Levantaram a mão aqui. Grazie. Sorry, Alex.
No problem. It's only to say that I have actually shared also the Portuguese translation of the book of Uwe Flick, okay, in PDF.
Thanks. So, aí ele está colocando uma série de textos que eles usam, tá? Tem em inglês, tem alguma coisa em português também. Então, vamos lá. Dana? Dana, are you there?
Oi.
Okay. You can ask the question.
Ela quer falar em português ou fala em inglês?
Não, fala do jeito que você quiser. eu traduzo se você falar em português.
Good afternoon, Professor Paulo. I'm Dana Aristizábal. I am a doctoral student with Professor Silviani. I want to ask, I think it's a simple question about the relationship of this proposal with the expanded basic mediational triangle and the levels of artifacts proposed by Cole.
Yeah, so you need some more information about this this topic. The triangulation of mediation starts with reference to organization studies. In reality, from Cole, he worked with Engström, Hero Engström. He was a Scandinavian researcher, and they proposed this model of mediation to try to assess how inside an organization different tools give us different results in our practice. I mean, in the 80s and 90s, there was a big revolution towards informatization of process in exactly Engström, Cole, and Engström. And thank you, Matthias, for.
Matthias is a false name.
Okay.
I couldn't change it. I didn't have time to change it. Sorry.
And also the observation that the use of the artifacts are never, or quite never, the one intended by the proposing of the artifact. So who developed the artifact? You can see how the artifact will be used. So observing this triangulation, this basic triangulation, we see also how the instruments change in time every time we use it in a different way. For example, in Italy, when the first mobile phone were introduced, we use it a lot for the messaging more than for speaking to other people, because there's difference in tariff, in the cost of use of the telephone than on sending short message text. And so the models that are sold in the time in Italy all came from this particular use that we do with the cellular. And I remember that in the same time in the US, there's a very different use of the cellular phone. They already has the pager and other system to text to each other, so they use the telephone much less than the Italian people, also for communicating. So they push the technology and at the same time try to interrupt the use of the pager and the other instruments. So maybe to respond to your question, this simple model of triangulation in reality is multidimensional. So there's different artifacts of mediation involved in the same interaction. So, for example, when we analyze the interaction in work environments, like a research team that are discussing an issue on their research, and this team is made up of different disciplines, we usually see that they use different artifacts to interact. Immaterial artifacts as the way in which their discipline define the object of the study. For example, working with economists and thinking about the change that energy transition could give to to people living in different areas of the world, it's very different, this meaning from the economists and the psychologists. We are using the same, we think we are using the same artifact, the meaning of what would be a better place from an ecological point of view, but in reality we are using different mediation instruments, so we are acting upon different mediated objects. I don't know if I understand correctly your question, but I hope in some way answer to them.
Very clear. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Someone could help me with the comments on the chat, because I'm
trying to just translate some
okay,
of the.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank
It's
you.
because
Thank you
some people do not know how to speak or to understand English so quickly. And well, we have now Gabriela Mieto. Gabriela. She's a professor at our department.
Tio, vou falar em português, você me ajuda?
She's going to speak in Portuguese.
Okay. Obrigada, professor, grazie mille. Muito interessante, né, ouvir suas considerações sobre a mediação pela via da mediação do objeto. Esse é um assunto que tem me interessado muito nos últimos anos, em relação ao uso dos objetos para os bebês, né, para as crianças pequenas. E eu venho trabalhando pela perspectiva da pragmática do objeto, que é desenvolvida pelo grupo, né, da professora Cíntia Rodrigues, da Universidade Autônoma de Madrid.
Research group of Cíntia Rodrigues at the University of Madrid.
E acho que é interessante esse diálogo com o seu trabalho, porque justamente o trabalho, as pesquisas da pragmática do objeto, elas estão relacionadas aos 2 primeiros anos de vida.
She's working with this in the first 2 years of life.
E eu vejo, então, a possibilidade de um diálogo da gente seguir. Sempre eu sinto que tem um gap, né? Algo a se entender de como a teoria vai seguindo para os anos posteriores da infância ou, né, do desenvolvimento.
She must understand further to work with the theory, with the babies and the toddlers.
Yeah, if I can say something, because this thing resonates with one of past studies that I've done with pedagogists. We work on analyzing tools that used in the nursery with infants, and especially with the age group 0 to 3 years. And we watch and we analyze how the books, the illustrated books, are used by the educators, the social workers. So not only in the way in which what's present in the book, but how the educator use these artifacts interacting with the child. You know, we have quite numerous class in this school, and these artifacts are made to be used with maybe one child or a few children, and let them see what's in the book. But when you have a lot of babies and you have just one book and one educator for all of them, you need to adjust the way in which you use the artifacts, because you can't change the artifacts in this situation. And it's also interesting the way in which the school propose to the parents the use of these artifacts outside the context of the school. So they're working on also on the meaning that the artifact could have in a different situation. Because for the context of the school, the books is something that's central to the education process, whereas in the house, in the home environment, usually the book is something that requires a lot of energy by the parents. So they're used in some special moments, and now we see that their parents tend to use other technology just to entertain the child, but not to interact with the child. So they're trying to explain to parents how to use both this technology, the book, the illustrated book, and the internet and so on, but with different modalities. So I think that there's something in common with your suggestion.
Well, yes, I think so. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Você não tinha outra coisa para complementar? Ele falou, deixa eu só comentar.
Ah, sim. Eu vou retomar aqui, que agora eu já expandi o que eu estava pensando também. Não, justamente, eu queria mais compartilhar essa possibilidade, né, do diálogo, e pensando que há coisas bastante em comum, né, ao que o grupo tem feito, sobretudo relacionado aos 2 primeiros anos de vida, né, e aí, claro, né, tem várias questões específicas que ficariam para um outro momento de conversa, mas sobre a questão do desenvolvimento da autorregulação, desenvolvimento de questões relacionadas aos precursores de pensamento superiores, né, da imaginação, que já começam a ser vistos nessa triangulação, né, do adulto, do objeto material e dessa pequena criança, né, como justamente o compartilhamento dos significados, mas que perpassa necessariamente pelo uso desse objeto, né, alguém mais experiente no uso desse objeto, poder compartilhar com essa pequena criança e o desenvolvimento ir ocorrendo, né? É isso, antes da fala.
Shared with the children. So it's just that she wants to continue with a dialogue with your group, so that as there are some there are many things in common and many things that are specific to 2 years old children. So
yes.
Yeah, okay, sure. We can discuss about this if you want, also in another moment.
Tomorrow morning. You can come.
Yes.
At 10.
Yeah.
Okay. Quem mais? A Wilsa. Now it's another professor from our department. This is Wilsa.
Hello, Paolo.
Hello.
Silviane, thank you very much. Paolo, we have a small group that we are studying digital culture. And we are studying, we are trying to comprehension what is digital culture, because we are affiliation with subjective theory. The Fernando González Rey, no, I don't know if you know this name,
no.
But he is from Latin American. He was a Cuban man and very clever. He developed a theory of subjectivity. But first of all, my question for you, I have a lot of questions, but in other time, how do you understand what is digital culture and how is connected with our development like a human being. Because for me, in this time, I believe that we don't try to look for the technology just for technology. But for me, the more important is understand what people is doing with technology, how this is how the technology has been incorporated in our practice, and how technology is mediating our comprehension of the world, our way of teaching and learning, our way of how to say, to be a human in this world, digital world with a lot of information, fake news. In Brazil, we are we are terrible with our president, with fake news and the distortion of the information. Então, how do you consider in your affiliation with cultural psychology, where we need to put our eyes to study cultural, digital culture? That is my question.
Okay.
Thank you.
It's a very interesting question, because it allows me to talk another half an hour maybe, because I do a lot of research on ethnography. So in reality, 20 years ago, I started with these topics of research, how technology changed the way in which we interact, especially internet technology. And now I'm studying how the internet profiling, the way in which Google profiles your behavior on internet, influence your life on internet, on the web. And we studied this starting with an idea that we hope that the access to internet makes us more aware of the social context. The idea is that we don't know some information, and internet can give us this information. So we test this hypothesis by creating a questionnaire where we ask people some basic, to estimate some basic characteristic of politics and social context in Europe, like the number of migrants last year in Italy, the number of migrants last year in Germany. You have to guess the percentage. And then for the other group, this was the control group, the experimental group has to do this task using their cell phone. So they are profiled, and they use what Facebook or the tools that they use to get this information give them. And then a third group use an anonymized browser, like DuckDuckGo. That's the browser that does no profiling. So he gives the same result.
Non riusciamo a ascoltarti, sentirti.
Ele fechou o microfone, Silviane. Pede para ele repetir essa parte final.
Sì, se puoi ripetere che hai detto. Pensiamo che il tuo microfono è chiuso.
No, it's not closed, my mic. It's
now we can hear. Now we hear you.
You can hear. I just asked some to my colleagues here. State usando, Noemia, Alex, state usando connessione internet in questo momento, a parte quello che stiamo
Eles
facendo?
estão ali perto. O Alex e a Noêmia
Voi
estão
state
perto.
usando internet lì? No.
E aí
We have
vai
one
fechar.
connection.
Ti sentiamo.
Yes. Okay, now there was maybe someone using more bandwidth. I said that, so we have three groups, one control group that do this task, just guessing the number. Another group, first experimental group, do this task using their cell phone, their smartphone, and the third group used an anonymized browser, DuckDuckGo, a browser where there's no profiling, so it gave the same result to every user. And we see a main effect. So the use of internet gives better results, but we see that for some topics, the use of the smartphone gave worse result than the other two groups. And in a way that extremely out of the right number. So we go to analyze this specific question. The first questionnaire is made up of 22 questions, so it's quite long to respond. And we focus only on the question that arise this difference in the use of the smartphone. And we see that all are the most used topic by the populist agenda. So the right-wing party are using a network of newspaper, of internet content delivery system that are all going to the same wrong estimate, the wrong information. It's not really a fake news. A fake news usually is something that's constructed to be used very in a specific moment and then forgot. In this case, these are information that helps to construct the way in which we view the operates of the politics in the European community. So there's something that links the two things. So an algorithm that is quite under no control, also by Google. Google hasn't the real control on its algorithm. But on the other way, it used very proficiency by this interest group that wants to push some, not only fake news, but some vision specific for the public. And now we are trying to do a very similar work, but analyzing the content of Twitter and see if this kind of polarization is present also in the behavior of the people who read this information. So we tweet on the social media and what kind of sentiment they want to communicate with their tweet. So it's very interesting the way in which technology. I don't talk about digital culture. I think that is it's a term that I prefer not to use because it recalls me of some not really data-founded theory, like the theory on the digital divide. In Italy, we speak a lot about digital divide, thinking of the difference between the youngest and the oldest. But when I confront myself with my students, that are quite younger than me, I notice that they are not at all aware of what the technology is, the technology that they are using. My generation, born without the technology, we construct this kind of technology. So we are the actor, the developer who knows how the things works on internet. And now the new generation just see these, they don't think of internet, they think of Google, Facebook, Instagram. They think of something that's not the real infrastructure. So the infrastructure now tends to become invisible to the user. And this is quite complex because it's the idea that we are using an artifact that inside these artifacts are some elements that are invisible to us. The idea of the profiling and the algorithm, but also other things that is quite difficult to comprehend. The same problem, and so this could be a kind of digital divide. But if you see it from another point of view, you see that politicians in Italy want to regulate the internet. Some 15 years ago, one minister proposed to archive in paper all the content of internet. And he said that Italy must have a space, a physical space, to archive physically all the content of internet. So clearly he has no idea of what he's talking about. So there's another kind of digital divide here that is something that is not linked with the use of technology, but the meaning that we associate with the technology. So I think that a very interesting way of studying this is to observe how the technology is used entering inside this context. So, for example, we are studying now Tinder app to see how COVID changed the way in which people form relationships throughout this application. And we see that users don't know how this application is built and how it works, what's the rule inside this environment. So we try to see how they use the technology, how change the technology. And to do this kind of thing, we have to construct two avatars and pretend to be user of the platform. So we do some kind of ethnography, but it was uncovered. So we explicitly tell the other people that we are an avatar from the university, but we are living in the space like other users. So it's something that you can no more observe from the outside. You need to take part of this kind of interaction to see the real meaning exchanging by the people. But if you want, we can speak about this for days. It's one of my favorite topics of research. So.
Grazie.
Prego.
Mais alguém, gente? Estamos cedo, vamos lá. Quem mais? Eu não estou vendo todo mundo.
The YouTube streaming is going.
It's going, but I have switched it off. It's only to give some general information. I shared some books with you, which are classics of sociology and social psychology. Some of these books are in Portuguese too, like from Berger Luckmann, Erving Goffman, etc., to explain how this kind of methodology, which Paulo Cotone proposed, has originated, because it has originated from several fields like anthropology, sociology, etc. And this is a model which can be applied to a lot of topics of research. I have also shared two of our publications, I've realized, together with Paulo. One is in Portuguese, which proposes a critical discourse analysis on transgender identities throughout the software Tanzana, which was one of the qualitative softwares proposed by Paulo, which is not so popular here in Brazil, but it's very interesting for doing a categorical analysis beyond content analysis. And in addition, another article which is doing content analysis throughout another software, which is the pay version of Remotech, which is assessed, very popular here in Brazil too. So you have now a really complete by bibliography and references, classical books and other information which could be very useful for you. And I really thank Paulo too for having shared with us some classical volumes of cultural psychology. You will really enjoy, and you will find a lot of methodological and theoretical stimulations for your work of research and production of scientific knowledges. Okay, it's only to give some informations. And now I leave the last 10 minutes for eventual other comments and contributions for you, for whom may be interested to share our conversation.
Quem mais quer fazer perguntas? I would really like to know more about your multidisciplinary, multi-areas project on energy. If you could tell them a little bit about the part that psychology takes in these projects, the environmental and projects that you have in your lab. Well, can we do, should we do a break, a little break before going on, or?
I think that we have, I asked to Noemia now if she confirms we have an appointment.
Another appointment? Okay, then we can go on.
Okay.
Yeah, Siliani asked if we can make a break now and maybe continue later.
We can take a break and we will continue 5 minutes later. 15 minutes.
Então, vamos fazer um pequeno intervalo, e aí eu pedi para ele, depois do intervalo, contar para a gente como que é o projeto dele multidisciplinar, e como que a psicologia e as ciências sociais trabalham e humanas trabalham junto com os engenheiros, enfim, com outras áreas.
Beleza.
Tá? A gente não precisa...
E eu acho que a gente pode falar também do acordo internacional na segunda parte.
Sim, podemos também.
Silviane, Silviane, pergunte para ele também, que você falou que eles têm um laboratório de realidade aumentada, que eles desenvolvem objetos virtuais. Você pede para ele comentar?
She wants you to comment to the work with...
Virtual Reality Laboratory.
Ok, então vai haver também um comentário sobre realidade aumentada na clínica, eles usam na clínica e nas organizações, tá? Então, gente, não precisa sair daqui, vamos fazer assim, só fechamos as câmeras e o som para a gente fazer...
Desativa o som.
15 minutos de intervalo, ok?
I'll interrupt the streaming on YouTube, okay?
Okay.
Because we are live on YouTube now.